When you started fly fishing, did you ever hear about mending fly line and wonder what in the heck that meant? What do you mean, mend the fly line? I'm here to fish, not fix stuff. Okay, dad jokes aside, mending is one of those skills that can actually level up your fly fishing pretty quick if you figure it out. Good mending can be the difference between a pretty meh day on the water and one of those unforgettable days, right? So we're going to talk about mending and a whole bunch more on today's episode of Untangled. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant, coming to you from the shadow of Yellowstone, up here in now troutless Wyoming. Remember, don't forget the great trout extinction event of 2023 here in Wyoming. It's really tragic. Oh shoot! No, thanks for tuning in, folks. Appreciate you listening each week. It just means that I get to keep having fun. You keep listening, I get to keep having fun doing the show. And speaking of shows, we got pretty good lineup of topics, I think, this week. We're going to be talking about good knots for big fish, matching the hatch, rigging up nymphs, streamers for pike, tips on mending, and felt versus studded rubber for your wading boots. So a lot of good stuff we can really kind of sink our teeth into. But before we get to that part of the show, we've got a giveaway winner to announce. That's right. We've got the winner of the Fly Flinger Rod and Reel combo giveaway. So let's cue up a drum roll, please. And the winner is Cheryl Jensen. Congrats, Cheryl. You are the winner, and we're going to be in touch with you ASAP. We'll get you the Fly Flinger Rod and Reel out the door from our wonderful shipping department and get that to you as quick as we can. I just ask one thing. Take some pictures of the fish that you catch with it and send it on in to us here at VFC. We'd love to see it. And that goes for anybody. If you're catching fish on our flies or on any of our gear, send pics in. Let us see it. I love to see that from you guys. It's a lot of fun. All right. Well, with that out of the way, I'm sure there's something to prepare everybody for. I just don't know what right now off the top of my head. I know Alex is going to be here for another episode soon. I think he and I are fishing next week, and we're kicking around some ideas for a fun episode. Next week's episode is featuring me and Alex, though, so you'll definitely want to tune in for that. It's about picking the right fly for any fishing situation. So there's a lot of really good information in that show, and that's next week's episode. You definitely don't want to miss it. All right, with that, folks, I think we're just going to jump right into it today. We've got a lot of topics. So let's start out with the first of our short questions. David from California writes in and says, "Hi there, my son and I are going to Alaska in August. What would be the best knot for these big fish?" And David, that's a pretty good question, and congrats on the Alaska trip. I'm going to be up there in August as well. Probably not. I'm going up into the interior to do a little grayling and possibly Arctic char fishing. We're going to see what shakes out there. We may or may not have access to a plane, so we'll see what happens. But congrats on the Alaska trip. If it's the first time that you've been, you're going to love it. You're going to fall in love with that place. It's the best. Now, a lot of anglers overthink their knots. And in reality, it's simple. Just use the clinch knot. All right. I know some folks out there love the Davy knot. I know Tom Rosenbauer and I were talking about knots a while ago, and he loves the Davy knot. It's a great little knot. I grew up using the clinch, so it's just kind of what I go for. The only times that I've had the clinch give out on me are if I tied a bad one, which happens more than we will usually admit, right? So just use the clinch. Keep it simple. It's a good knot. That's the knot I use when I'm going after salmon up in Alaska as well. It's just a good, solid knot. It works. So don't complicate your fishing trip when you need to. Our next short question, Eric from Kansas writes in, "What should I use to catch 3 to 6 pound brown trout that are feeding on 5-inch long suckers in a small Colorado lake at 9,000 foot elevation. Well, Eric, you really kind of answered your own question there. If you know the fish are eating those 5-inch long suckers, then dude, pick a streamer that looks reasonably similar to those and start fishing. Like, don't overthink this at all, man. It's really simple. If you know, knowing what they're eating is like 90%, well, okay, not 90. It's probably half the battle. The other half is presentation. But if you know that's what they're eating, tie something on. It does not need to look perfect. It doesn't need to look exactly like those suckers. It just needs to look close enough that the fish are going to see it and go, oh, yeah, that looks really tasty. I'm going to go nibble on that. And then boom, they're caught. You put them in the net. You get a picture of it, you put it on Instagram, right? Because we go fly fishing for Instagram, right? That's why we do it. Yeah. No, please no. Please no. That's not why we do it. We do it for the TikToks. Duh. Oh, I kid. Seriously, though, if you know that's what they're eating, tie something on that looks like that. Throw it out there. You're going to be in business. So, remember, it doesn't have to be a perfect match. Okay, just get it close enough, and they'll probably partake of it. All right, with that, we're going to jump into the main part of this week's show. First question comes to us. Brad from Tennessee writes in, and I mean, I've already used my cheesy pickup line about Tennessee, but you know what? I'll dish out another good cheesy pickup line for you today. If you were a burger at McDonald's, you'd be the McGorgeous. I know, don't quit my day job, but I am here all week, folks. I've got so many bad pickup lines. I loved them. I still love them. I think they're hilarious. And then seeing as I teach high school, you get to hear even more ridiculous ones. So if you ever need any, folks, just drop me a line. I've got a few. Anyways, Brad from Tennessee writes in and he says, hey, man, love the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to answer questions, and I've learned a lot. Maybe more of a basic question that could go multiple ways, but when you are fishing with multiple nymphs, do you prefer to have the heavier nymph as your point fly on the end with smaller nymphs above, or the opposite with the larger nymph above the smaller fly trailing below? And does this change based on the type of water you're fishing? Thanks a lot. Well, hey, Brad, that's great to hear. And thanks a bunch for the kind words. I'm really excited that you've been learning something from the show. That's the whole point of the show. You know, bad dad jokes and my feeble attempt at humor aside, that's the whole point of putting this show together, right? Is to help folks. So I'm really glad that you've been able to learn something from the show. Now, your question, this is excellent, right? To quote philosophers Bill and Ted, be excellent to each other. I introduced my wife actually to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, like a year ago, because she'd never seen it. And me and my best friend keep quoting it to each other all the time. And she's like, what are you guys talking about? And I was like, have you never seen Bill and Ted's? And she hadn't. I had no clue. Like, we'd been married for like a year, I think. And she'd never seen Bill and Ted's. So I also corrupted her with Planes, Trains, and Automobiles too. Anyways, I will get off my classic movies tangent and get back to the fly fishing here. Really good question that you sent in, Brad. The important thing to remember with nymph rigs is that there's like an infinite way to rig these things up. So, and I kind of went back and forth on how to answer your question here because I do like to give as much information as I can, but being a podcast, it's kind of tough because I can't always give like, it's not like where I can sit here with diagrams and point them out to everybody, right? Because a lot of folks probably listen to podcasts in the car, and the last thing I want you to do is be looking at the video podcast like, oh yeah, that's a very good nymph rig. And then, crash and die. I wouldn't want that to happen to anybody. So I kind of decided to go, I wanted to answer this in a way that made sense to me and that addresses the question that I think you're asking. So again, there is like an infinite way to rig all of these up. Alex, for example, he loves bounce rigs. And if anybody here has fished conventional fishing, it's like the fly fishing version of a drop shot rig. That's what a bounce rig is. I prefer to use the standard nymph rig under an indicator or to Euro nymph. If I'm at a nymph, I either just throw some nymphs on under the indicator, or I bust out the Euro rod and I nymph that way. I really don't like dealing with like the 90-degree or slip rig systems. Those are great and they're effective. That's not what I learned. And so it almost feels like it's more of a pain in the butt for me to set those up. And so I'm lazy sometimes. So, I don't want to spend all that time rigging them up. And my just standard 2 nymphs under an indicator rig works well enough. So I haven't seen a need to change that and if I do, it's to Euro nymph and just get things straight down to the bottom. So with all that in mind, I'm going to try and answer this in the context of you just got your indicator and 2 nymphs underneath it. And that's the kind of nymph rig that we're going to talk about. So with that said, sorry, let me back up. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I just mentioned all these different rigs. And the reason I brought these up is in all those different systems, like a Euro rig or 2 nymphs under an indicator or a 90-degree or a slip rig, you're going to put your heaviest fly at different places, depending on what you're trying to get that rig to do. For example, you would make the heaviest fly the bottom fly or the point fly, is what it's called, in a Euro rig. You want your heaviest fly on the bottom in a Euro rig. And the idea behind having all of these different nymphing rigs and systems is it really kind of depends on what you think is the best way to get those flies down to where the fish are feeding. And as I mentioned, I learned how to do this. I learned how to nymph with two nymphs under an indicator. And I think that's how a lot of beginners go about it. I sometimes I'll see beginners trying to do like a bounce rig, but I really see the 2 nymphs under an indicator most. And that's what I teach folks too when I'm guiding is that rig, just because it's simple, but it's really, really effective. So that's why there's so many different rigs, is it's just a different way to get the flies to where the fish are going to be. Now I'm going to move into saying that I'm going to answer the rest of this question with the idea that we're going to talk about the standard 2 nymphs under indicator rig, because again, I think it's the one that makes the most sense for beginners to use, and it's still the one that I use. And I'm not sitting here saying like, oh, I'm some kind of expert, right? I know everything and I still use this. No, I'm not a beginner anymore, and it's still a rig that I use. That's where I'm trying to go with it. So the short answer is that I will always tie my heaviest nymph on first. So I like that to be the top fly in my rig. Then I'm going to put the next smallest fly under that. So if I have like a size 10 Pat's rubber leg stone, I'm going to put that on top, and then I'm going to put my size 16 zebra midge right underneath it. Okay. Or even if the size discrepancy isn't that big, like say I've got a 14 Prince nymph and a size 16 Juju Betas, for example, the Prince nymph goes on top, the size 16 Juju Betas goes underneath it. The reason that you rig up like this, the reason that I do it, is it's going to cast better, both in your roll casts and if you have to do like an overhead cast, if you're in a situation where that's how you need to nymph, if you're casting directly upstream, it's going to cast so much better. Because think of your nymph rig just like the taper on a leader. You don't put the heaviest bit right at the very end, do you? No, you put the lightest bit right at the very end. Same thing with a nymph rig. You go to your heaviest bit down to your lightest fly. And when you do that, it kind of tapers it. It casts a lot better. I think it's a little bit easier to manage in the water. That's kind of some anecdotal evidence for me. I don't have some science or like an empirical study to sit down and say, oh yes, they handle so much better in the water. That sounds like something that somebody needs to get onto though. So maybe some of our colleagues at a university somewhere can get on a study like that for us. I'd be willing to participate in said study if they need any help. But I just think they cast better and they handle better. So that's how I rig those things up. Hopefully this helps. All right. I know it was kind of a confusing walkthrough, and I tried to take us through it all. in a way that made sense. But if you need clarification, though, please don't hesitate. Reach out to me. I'll do what I can to clarify. And I do think we're going to be doing a really in-depth nymphing episode on the podcast soon. I'm not sure when. It's one Alex and I are going to do together, but it's going to be in the near future. So definitely stay tuned for that. And you'll get to learn more than you ever thought you could about nymph rigs. All right, wonderful question. Thanks a bunch for that. I appreciate it. Next question, Patrick from Colorado writes in, says, hey, love what you were doing with the show, and I love tuning in on my drive to work. I want to target some northern pike out here in Colorado this season. I was wondering what some of your favorite streamers would be, and if you have recommendations for easier to tie patterns as well. Cheers and tight lines. Well, Patrick, I'm glad to hear there's still people in Colorado who don't just fish for trout. Oh, I kid. That's like saying, Montana anglers should start fishing for carp. You say that and they raise their hackles a little bit. No, I'm kidding about that too. There's nothing wrong with fishing for carp at all. I promise. It's not. Okay, I'm being serious now. All right. Good question, Patrick. Thank you. And I'm glad that I'm of assistance on your way to work as well. Good to know that I can help take the sting out of the drive to work. Although hopefully you're not dreading going into work. All right. I don't know exactly how much help I can be on the easy to tie side of things, because my streamers are all more complicated than they should be. It's just kind of where I've ended up in my fly tying craft. But I will say that Lefty's Deceiver by the late great Lefty Cray is a fly that you should tie for pike. That's one that was mentioned to me and that I saw on a whole bunch of different lists, because I don't fish for pike a whole ton. So I put out some feelers, talked to a few folks, read a few articles and lists and whatnot, and then compiled the little list that I'm going to share with you. But before I do get into those recommendations, I want to share this quote from a piece that the folks over at Yellow Dog Fly Fishing, the travel company, they put together a pretty good little piece on pike fishing, and they had this quote that I thought everybody should hear. They said, quote, pike are not extremely picky fish, but fly selection matters depending on water clarity, structure, and depth. You don't want to be stuck with lead-eyed flies when you are fishing for pike in 3 feet of water filled with weeds. That's a really good rule of thumb. Make sure you've got a good variety of flies when you're chasing pike. The times that I've done it, I think I've been hamstrung because I haven't had a great variety of flies. I've been in those situations where I just had really heavy flies and I was fishing shallow water. There was a place down in Utah, kind of about where I grew up. My buddy and I, Colby, good buddy of mine, we would run down and we would fish all the time, chasing pike down here at this little lake. And we were just throwing giant spinner baits on spinning poles for a little bit. And then I brought the fly pole out and I just had these enormous, just gaudy streamers. They were heavy. It was like throwing a brick on the end of my fly line. And problem was that little lake wasn't very deep, especially from shore where we were fishing. It was maybe 4 feet deep at the most. So my flies hit the water, they splash and scare any fish that might be close by. And then they just sink right down and get snagged, and I lost them, and they were like $7 a pop. So it wasn't exactly a wonderful pike fishing experience for me. That just goes to back up what the folks over at Yellow Dog said. So with that in mind, these are the five, not the five, but 5 patterns that I'd recommend that you go grab for pike. You want Chocolate's Game Changer, Blaine Chocolate, wonderful fly tire. Chip's Northern Magic, that's a pretty easy to tie pattern. The Pike Bunny, the Banger, which is a topwater lure, like a popper that you use for bass, and then the EP Pike Fly. So those are the 5 I recommend that you tie for pike. Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate the question. Next question, Josh from Pennsylvania writes in and says, I have a question about mending. I've watched countless videos on the topic, but when I go to mend my fly line, it either moves the indicator or doesn't mend enough of the line, it just creates a big belly. Also, love the show and podcast. Josh, great topic, and thank you for your love for the show and the podcast. Really appreciate that. Thank you. As I hinted in the beginning of the show, in our hook for the show, mending is a critical skill. So with that in mind, I want to start at the beginning of mending, go through everything you need to know about it, lay it all out here as best I can in an audio format, explain mending. That way, for those folks who are really new to fly fishing, don't know what mending is, you're going to get a great education on it. And then for those of us who have started fly fishing, this is going to be a good refresher and hopefully cement the foundation knowledge that you need to master this here skill. So, first off, what is a mend? No, you're not fixing the line, which that's what I thought mending was when I first heard the term. I was out there on the water, and my dad didn't tell me to mend. I don't know what he called it, but it wasn't. I didn't hear it from my dad. Plus, my dad didn't nymph. My dad fished dry flies, and if they didn't need a dry fly, he didn't catch them. So that's how he was. That's how he still is. And I admire the heck out of that. The dedication to one style of fishing. It takes more self-sufficiency, I think, than other being able to do everything. But that's neither here nor there. The guy that taught me how to nymph, though, we're out there and throw a nymph rig and it's drifting down the water, and he's like, mend it. And I'm like, what? It's broken? I broke it? No, you mend it. Well, I don't know how to fix it. No, not like that, you idiot. And then he showed me how to mend it, and I was like, oh, I'm an idiot. I didn't know that's what that was called. So, mending, not fixing the fly line. It's really simple. Okay. All a mend is, and all a mend should do, is move your fly line once it's already on the water without interrupting your drift. Really simple, right? Well, very simple in theory, but in practice, as Josh from Pennsylvania has experienced, it can be a little difficult, and it is. It's a difficult thing. I'm not ragging on you at all, Josh. It is kind of a difficult skill to master. So, why would you need to mend line? Let's start there. Well, mending line is a very key tool to get rid of drag, and it can extend the length of your drift. And as we all know, if your flies are dragging, the fish ain't going to eat them. You could have the perfect fly in the perfect spot in the water column, but if it's dragging, if it's trailing a wake like a surfer, okay, fish ain't going to eat that. They're going to see that, oh yeah, that's that Spencer guy trying to catch us again. Loser, I'm not going to eat that. Yeah, that's what's going through their minds. All right. You don't want that going through their minds. You want them thinking, oh, that's a very beautiful rainbow warrior. Don't mind if I do. A little hors d'oeuvre before dinner. I don't know why the trout are so classy all of a sudden. For all I know, they're, country bumpkins just like me. Anyways, that's what mending is. That's why we need it. If you're nymphing or if you're fishing like a dry dropper rig and you're casting across the river instead of upstream or downstream, your fly line is going to land across multiple currents. Those currents are likely going to pull your fly line ahead or downstream or below your indicator, right? So you're going to have your indicator, and then the fly line is going to make this big belly, and it's going to cause all this drag. And you've probably done that and seen that drag, and you're like, well, how do I fix it? Well, you mend the line, and you really are fixing the drift, right? That's probably why we call it mending. But all your mend is moving all of that fly line back up above your indicator, keeping your drift drag-free and natural. You can also mend to extend a drift by stacking a bunch of mends on top of each other, a bunch of short, smaller mends on top of each other. That helps when you're in a situation where you need to keep your indicator floating in slow water while your fly line is in fast water. Those instances happen if it's just too far away for you to high stick, or there's just no way to high stick that drift in there. You just have to throw a cast and then mend, and try and extend the length of that drift in the slower water while all your fly line's in the faster water. So those are your use cases for mending. Those aren't that's not every instance where you're going to need a mend. Those are the most common ones, though. Drag-free drift and extending the drift. So how exactly are you supposed to execute a mend? Well, it is pretty simple. And Josh, I think you might be overthinking it a little bit. I know I certainly did when I started nymphing and mending and whatnot. It's a common thing for us anglers to fall into is overthinking because this is a very technical sport. It can be. And so it's really easy to like dive into the details and just overthink all your techniques. The way that I had it explained to me that makes sense is don't think of it as flicking or casting your line. You're not trying to flick it, right? It's not a booger that you're trying to flick off your fingers. Nobody sees you. Just pick your nose at the ballet. All right. You literally just want to pick that line up and move it. That's all a mend is. You are just picking line up and moving it. The key is you're doing that without moving your indicator, or if you've got a dry dropper rig on, without moving your dry fly. That's where it gets tricky, but not impossible. I was actually out fishing yesterday. I had to go all the way to Nebraska for it, though, thanks to the Great Wyoming Fish Gill of 2023. And I actually sat and watched how I mend so I could describe it exactly. I wanted to really figure this out for you. And I sat and watched how I mend. When I threw a mend, I would lift the rod, get a few feet of line off the water, and then using my whole forearm, I'm not doing with just the wrist, I'm using my whole forearm, I would move the rod in whatever direction I needed to for the mend, and then I would end with a very slight snap of the wrist. So I'd just pick it up, move with the forearm, very slight snap of the wrist at the end. The key that I realized of what I was doing is that I was making it a fluid motion and I wasn't stopping. If you stop, you lose all of the inertia and the line's not going to mend correctly. So you want that to be a very fluid motion, picking up and ending with a very, very slight snap of the wrist. I also realized that I use the whole rod. I'm not trying to do this with just the tip section. I think that's something else that we fall into is we think a mend's got to be very delicate and very precise. And precise, yes. Delicate, not really. So we try to just use the tip. We're just going to barely move. We're just going to inch it over here. We're just going to barely move it. It's going to be perfect. It's going to look so beautiful. We'll put a little bow on it. No. Okay. Use the whole rod. Your rod's there for a reason. All right. Use the whole stinking rod. And that was really it. That was what I realized I was doing. So hopefully that makes some sense. So I want to recap this here for us. To make a mend, you're going to use the whole length of your rod. You're going to pick the line up and move it, ending with a slight flick of your wrist. Use a very fluid motion to get the most effective mend, and use your forearm to move that rod. Don't try and move it all with your wrist. Okay. Use your forearm, get a little bit of power behind it. And at the end of the day, you just really got to practice this because it's a skill that you're only really going to master when you're out on the water. It's hard to try to make mends work if you're just lawn casting because there's no surface tension on your fly line like there will be on the river or on the lake. So you really need to get out on the water to actually practice this. But the other key thing to remember here is that even a good mend, it will probably move your indicator or dry fly a little bit. That's not the end of the world. Your goal is to move it as little as possible. Ideally, it won't move at all, but that's not always feasible. So hopefully that was helpful, Josh. And if you need any clarification on that at all, please write in, let me know. I'd be happy to expound more. Rounding out the show today, Joe from New Hampshire writes in. Joe says, Spencer, felt versus rubber with studs for wading boots. I fish mostly areas with a lot of moss-covered rocks in a variety of sizes from pebbles to small boulders. I have a rubber with studs currently, which is much better than no studs, but find sometimes I still lose traction. Do you think felt would be better? I also have heard that felt is no good in muddy bottom ponds. Thanks, Teach. Joe, None of my students call me Teach. Maybe I gotta start asking them. I like that. That's not too bad. Not too bad of a moniker there. This is a really good question and pretty simple answer. Felt is awesome for traction. Felt's probably the best for traction that I've personally used, but it absolutely sucks for hiking, especially if you do any winter fishing. The last thing you want to do, oh my gosh, I wore my wading boots and waders ice fishing a while ago. No, more than a while ago, like probably almost a decade ago. And I had felt bottoms on the wading boots, and I just woke up at an unholy hour, grabbed my stuff, got in my buddy's car, and we got down to the lake, and there was like a foot and a half of brand new snow on the ice. And I walked out there in my felt bottom boots, and after about 3 steps, I had just this enormous, like 5-foot long clump of snow stuck to the bottom of my boots. It was awful. So felt is terrible for winter hiking as well. Plus, when you hit ice and felt, it's slippery. All right. You would think it sticks. Maybe it was just me, but it didn't stick for me. I was slipping all over the place. Man, it was terrible. Looked like a drunk ice skater out there. It was not good. So felt is really good though for traction on moss covered stuff, but got a pretty big downside. It can actually transport aquatic diseases and invasive species. You're actually not allowed to wear felt wading boots at all in Alaska for that reason. They don't want the New Zealand mud snails. They don't want whirling disease. They don't want any of the other little parasites that you can transfer from one river to another via the felt on your wading boots. So for that reason, I'd say just stick away from felt because our rivers have enough trouble facing them. The last thing that we need to do is add more to that and make things harder on them with some invasive species stuff they don't need. So studded rubber is the way to go, in my opinion. If you feel like that's not quite enough traction, you can go for the aluminum bars instead of the studs. Corkers actually makes a great sole. It's called their Alumatrax sole. It's got this giant aluminum bar across the bottom. Those things are money, especially for really mossy stuff. I would recommend those. And the really nice thing about Corkers is their soles are interchangeable, so you can pull one sole off, put another sole on. So you can put like the bare rubber soles on if you're going to climb into a drift boat, because the last thing that you want is studded soles in a drift boat. Trust me on that. Don't do it. So that's what I would do, Joe. Studded rubber or the aluminum bars across the bottom is going to be your best bet. And with that, folks, coming to an end here. Another great episode of Untangled in the books. Appreciate y'all listening through. And really excited to just keep this ball rolling. As always, if you have any questions about fly fishing that you'd like answered, please, there's always a link in the podcast description. Submit your questions so we can keep the show rolling. That's what keeps everything turning here at VFC and Untangled is your questions. So don't hesitate. There's no question too small or too big. We're Untangled. We'll tackle it some way or the other. With that in mind, make sure you're getting out on the water, enjoying this wonderful summer weather. And until next week, tight lines, everybody.